Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to the channel. We had some breaking news earlier today, and it's absolutely heartbreaking. Charles Oliveira versus Beneil Dariush is off UFC 288. And honestly, was UFC 289's main event being announced as Amanda Nunes versus Juliana Pena 3 not enough? Talk about kicking us when we're down, rubbing salt in the wound. This is devastating news. This is the fight I was really looking forward to on UFC 288. And now we're going to discuss what happens next. Do they rebook this fight? Do they find a new opponent for Beneil Dariush? And we're also going to discuss how can the UFC save UFC 288? Because UFC 288 is effectively ruined. So we're going to discuss some matchups that could be potentially added to 288 that would fix this card and make it at least somewhat palatable, because right now it looks absolutely atrocious. But we're going to talk about those matchups later in the video. And one of those matchups is actually a massive fight that could potentially be the main event over the current main event, which is Aljamain Sterling defending his bantamweight title against Henry Cejudo. So first off, the reaction to the news. I mean, I'm absolutely devastated. This was a fight that I was really looking forward to. This was a very big fight in the lightweight division. Beneil Dariush arguably already deserves a lightweight title shot. But, the UFC decided to book him against Charles Oliveira. Maybe Beneil wanted to stay active. You had Islam just defend his belt against Alexander Volkanovski at UFC 284. And it's basically known Islam is not fighting until October at UFC. I believe it's going to be UFC 294. So this made perfect sense. You had Beneil Dariush fight Charles Oliveira. Beneil wins this fight. I mean, he's already pretty much the number one contender, but he really cements it by defeating a former champion in Charles Oliveira. And then he would go on to fight Islam Makhachev in October in Abu Dhabi. And this was a great stylistic matchup. And this is the second time this fight has been booked in UFC history. Both times Charles Oliveira has pulled out. And I'm just devastated by this news, because also I know a lot of people were hoping this, and I was actually kind of hoping this as well. If Charles Oliveira went out there and starched Beneil Dariush, he's kind of on the short list of contenders in the lightweight division. Maybe he gets a rematch with Islam Makhachev. I don't know if that was necessarily going to happen, but that could have been a big fight that would have came out of this as well. But what are they going to do now that this fight is canceled off of UFC 288? Are they going to find Beneil Dariush a replacement? It doesn't look like it. According to current legitimate sources, I know there's a bunch of fake Instagram posts and this and that, but according to reliable sources online, the UFC is looking to postpone this fight. So I'm wondering, maybe could it be a Charles Oliveira, he got cut in training, maybe was sparring, got cut, and they're going to move it to UFC 289 on June 10th, which really could use some help, because the main event is Amanda Nunes versus Juliana Pena 3, which is an absolute abomination. So I'm wondering if they're going to do something along those lines, because any further out, and again, we don't know Charles Oliveira's injury, so we don't know how long he's going to be out. Any further out, and then you start wondering, if it's not happening at the June pay-per-view, is it going to happen at the July pay-per-view? And then you're starting cutting it close for a training camp, a recovery after the fight, and then a training camp to fight Islam Makhachev in October, because Makhachev needs an opponent. So, if it's not moved to 289, or maybe a fight night card in June, maybe late June, if you put them in July, they fight, let's say they have a hard-fought, matchup, and one of them gets injured, they're going to need some time to recover and then have a full training camp to fight in October. So that's kind of cutting it close. So I think if they do reschedule it, it'll be like a month down the line. Maybe Oliveira got cut or something along those lines. But another thing they may do, and there's a recent history of this. They may just book Islam Makhachev versus Beneil Dariush at UFC 294. They may forget about Charles Oliveira versus Beneil Dariush. And the reason I say this has happened before is I'll remind you, last year or 2021, actually, I keep forgetting it's 2023. You go back to the end of 2021, I believe it was UFC 269. We were supposed to get Leon Edwards versus Jorge Masvidal. Masvidal pulled out. Leon Edwards was left without an opponent. And then Leon got an immediate title shot in, June or July, I think it was. Actually, I think it was August against Kamaru Usman, where he brutally head kick KO'd him. So there is kind of a scenario for this. They could do the same thing with Beneil Dariush. They could say, you know what, we're just going to forget about this fight. We want to guarantee Islam has an opponent for Abu Dhabi in October. Dariush already arguably deserves the shot, and we'll just give him a shot against Islam Makhachev. So I think those are the two most likely scenarios. They'll rebook it for June, or they'll just give Beneil Dariush the title shot and they'll just announce it, maybe next month, maybe in May, maybe in June, something along those lines, if they don't rebook Oliveira versus Dariush. Now, either of those options are great, for that fight in general or for Beneil Dariush. But no matter what, that leaves 288 looking horrendous. Because you look at 288 right now, the co-main event as it stands right now would be Jessica Andrade versus Yan Xiaonan. Ew, that is disgusting as a co-main event of a pay-per-view. I know we got spoiled with 285 and 287 and even 286 was really good as well. But this 288 card without Oliveira and Dariush is horrible. I mean, the featured fight on the card is going to be Kron Gracie versus Charles Jourdain. That's an ugly, ugly card. So we really have a UFC 288 that just looks horrible without this fight. Because honestly, even Aljamain versus, Henry Cejudo isn't the biggest main event to begin with. And, the UFC, people always talk about UFC's trying to draw pay-per-view numbers. If they leave the card as it is right now, this is going to do under 200,000 pay-per-view buys. It wouldn't shock me if it did under 100,000. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but you get my point. That's how low level this pay-per-view would be without this fight. They needed this massive lightweight fight. So how could they fix this? And I have a couple options. We're going to save the biggest possible option, but it's kind of unlikely for last. But I think the most sensible option to do is we have another lightweight fighter who's ranked in the top 10 who deserves a big fight. You have number 8 ranked Armin Sarukian, and I think the UFC should book Beneil Dariush versus Armin Sarukian as the co-main event for UFC 288. Sarukian was supposed to fight in 2 weeks. His opponent pulled out, Renato Moicano. Armin's looking for a fight. Well, guess what? Beneil Dariush just got freed up. Dariush wants to stay active. He says he'll fight anyone. And the UFC needs somebody on 288. And also, you go back and you look back at the history of the lightweight division. Armin Sarukian lost to Mateusz Gamrot, and it was borderline a robbery decision win for Gamrot. I don't want to go as far as to say it was a robbery, but it was very, very close. I think 2 of the judges gave round 4 to Gamrot, where he got dropped in that round by Armin. And I just think everything has come together. Charles Oliveira is injured. Renato Moicano is injured. Armin needs a big fight, and Dariush is wide open right now for UFC 288. And guess what? Gamrot, after he defeated Armin, went on to fight Dariush. So that would have been Armin's fight anyway. And right now, there's not a lot of options in the division. So I think that is a perfectly reasonable matchup. And I would absolutely love that fight. I mean, Beneil Dariush, we already know he's on a massive win streak. He's looked better than ever. The Gamrot fight, he looks so impressive. I don't even know how he didn't KO Gamrot. I think it was a right hand he landed that dropped him. And then you have Sarukian, who just beat Damir Ismagulov not that long ago and looked like an absolute world beater. And this could even be for a number 1 contender spot because Armin has a history with Islam. Fought him, I believe it was on short notice for his UFC debut, and it was even a competitive fight then. So a lot of people are dreaming of a future where you see Armin Sarukian versus Islam Makhachev in the future. So this still could be a number 1 contender fight. There's not a whole lot of options in the lightweight division in terms of deserving number 1 contenders right now outside of Beneil Dariush. So if Armin is able to beat him, and you erase that Gamrot loss from history because he should have won that fight, Armin's the most deserving. And this fight would be amazing because Armin is young. He's very well-rounded. His striking is ever improving. He has amazing grappling, amazing scrambles. And guess what? Beneil Dariush, very similar as well. I mean, these guys, honestly, these guys have very similar skill sets. Both very well-rounded, both very good grapplers, both have submission games, and both guys, striking is evolving fight to fight. So I think that is the most reasonable possibility. And Armin already tweeted out that he wants to fight Beneil Dariush on UFC 288. I guess technically they could put Beneil Dariush, maybe move him earlier if he's available for that, end of April card, but I doubt that's going to happen. If they make this fight, it will be on UFC 288 as the co-main event. And I think that will help beef up the card quite a bit. But what if they don't do that? What if they do one of the other options? What if they move Beneil Dariush and Charles Oliveira to, June 10th, UFC 289, or they give Beneil the title shot? What are we going to do at UFC 288? Because we need something else. They have to add something else. There's no way they leave it as is. It is just a horrendous pay-per-view card. So another option that I think is possible to throw on UFC 288, and this would be a massive co-main event, and that is Belal Muhammad versus Shavkat Rakhmonov. Belal Muhammad already tweeted out teasing that he wanted to fight at UFC 288. The UFC has already said, we want to book Belal Muhammad versus Shavkat Rakhmonov in his next fight. So why not throw it on a co-main event of UFC 288? That would help make the main card a lot better. That would be a substantial upgrade for the card. And it's very relevant to the welterweight division. The welterweight division is kind of in a weird spot where you have everyone not willing to fight and everyone claiming they deserve a title shot. And you would get a little bit of clarity here because the winner of Belal Muhammad versus Shavkat Rakhmonov would be unequivocally the number one contender in the division. And stylistically, that's such an intriguing fight because you have Shavkat, who's undefeated, has nothing but finishes in his entire MMA career. And then you have Belal Muhammad, who's on like an 8-fight win streak. He just finished Sean Brady in his last fight. Belal Muhammad, say what you will about him, he's a guy that's willing to fight anyone. He's been calling out Hamzat forever. He's been calling out Colby forever. He would take the Shavkat Rakhmonov fight. There's no doubt. And that would make UFC 288 substantially better. But what if they don't make that fight? What if for whatever reason, Shavkat's not ready. He just had a crazy fight with Jeff Neal not that long ago. And, UFC 288 is right around the corner. So what if they can't make that fight? The fight that I think they could make that would be the biggest for UFC 288 and I think would solve a lot of problems would be Colby Covington versus Belal Muhammad. This fight just makes perfect sense. And you could even do it for an interim welterweight title. And I tweeted this out and I got a lot of kind of responses like, interim title, are you crazy? I don't personally want the interim title. I don't like the interim title label on these fights. And the interim title is unnecessary. That's the history the UFC has set. They like to do that. And the reason I even say interim title is because you have guys like Colby saying, I'm not fighting unless I'm getting a title shot, basically. I'm going to sit out until I get a title shot. Well, now you're getting a title shot, essentially. They put the interim title on the line. It makes it more lucrative for both fighters to fight. They're fighting in a title fight. And now you have a situation where they could put that as the main event over top of Aljamain Sterling versus Henry Cejudo. And Belal Muhammad versus Colby Covington would have a very interesting dynamic. Belal's cringe, he's crazy. Colby Covington's crazy and cringe, and he stumbles over his pre-written lines that he paid $5 at the flea market for some guy to write for him. And I think that is a fight that would help save UFC 288. And with the interim title on the line, it could entice these guys to be more likely to take this fight. And you have Colby who's saying he's ready to go any day of the week. You have Belal who's saying he's ready to go. And then you have Leon Edwards, the champion of the division, saying, I'm not fighting till October. So you let Belal Muhammad versus Colby Covington take place at UFC 288 in May. The winner of that fight, they win the interim belt. That's essentially the number one contender belt. And then they fight Leon Edwards for the undisputed belt in October at UFC 294. And the UFC has shown a pettiness in the past. When a champion's not willing to work with them, they'll just say, okay, we'll make an interim belt. And that doesn't necessarily hurt the champ, but sometimes it's like a way to almost delegitimize them a little bit. And I think the UFC would definitely throw an interim title on the line for this fight. And, I think it's one of those things where it's not necessarily going to hurt Leon Edwards, but the UFC likes to do that. They did it with Francis Ngannou a while back where they did Cyril Gane versus Derek Lewis 4 months after Francis Ngannou won the title just because Francis Ngannou wasn't willing to fight on an exact date that they wanted to do. So they made an interim title fight. But in a perfect world for me, it would be Belal Muhammad versus Colby Covington for the number one contender spot, which is essentially what the interim title is. But I would rather just not have an interim title. I'm so sick and tired of hearing about interim titles. But I think that would save UFC 288. I mean, that would be massive. I mean, could you imagine we get Belal Muhammad versus Colby Covington on UFC 288? That would be a massive welterweight fight. That would help clear up the discussion. Colby Covington's getting a title shot on a 1-win streak over Congressman Jorge Masvidal. Undeserved title shot. Meanwhile, Belal Muhammad, who's put in the work, who has 3 wins over top 10 guys. Meanwhile, you have Colby Covington with the retirement of Jorge Masvidal. He doesn't even have a win on his entire UFC resume against a currently ranked welterweight. But he sat out, he hid in witness protection, And because he decided to weigh in at UFC 286 and help save the card, essentially, the UFC is gifting him a participation trophy title shot. And, now we clear some of that up because Leon's saying, I don't want to fight Colby. He's undeserving. And also Leon's saying, I'm not fighting in July. I want to fight in October. Well, now you solve all those problems and you save UFC 288 and you add a massive welterweight fight on that card. And then you have a true deserving #1 contender. Whoever wins, Belal Muhammad or Colby Covington, that is the true #1 contender in the welterweight division to take on Leon Edwards in October. And I think that just makes so much sense. And I hope that comes to fruition. So there's really a lot of moving parts here. There's a lot of potential options. But I really do believe the UFC has to find something else to throw on UFC 288 just to make that main card better. Otherwise, it's, a glorified like ESPN card with not even a strong lineup outside the main event where you have a bantamweight title fight. But let me know what you guys think about all this down in the comments. Also, comment down below, are there any other big fights or notable fights that the UFC could put on UFC 288 to kind of save the card and make the main card better? And also, do me a favor. It is super late right now. It is almost 3 a.m. Eastern time. I'm recording this video. I'm trying to hit 10,000 subscribers. So if you're not subscribed to the channel, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Don't forget to like this video. And thank you so much for watching.